Hello and welcome to Frap Talks, where we discuss anything related to modular synthesis with Frap Tools instruments. We will talk about something not strictly musical, but that can highly impact our performance and the way we approach our instruments, the user interfaces. The user interface is the connection between a device and its users. Any tool that we use in everyday life has its user interface, from a bicycle to an oven. Lab equipment and musical instruments too have their user interfaces, each developed for its own purpose. Since modular synthesizers stand somehow in between those two categories, it might be worth examining them before talking about how we at Frap Tools developed our user interfaces. An adjective that we often use to describe a device is intuitive, which defines how likely we can figure out what it does and how it works at a glance without any training. That is to say, using our intuition. Let's take for example this bass amplifier. First of all, there is a huge label that describes this device. Even if you never used one of them, you may see that there are some knobs, each with its own label. You may guess that if you rotate a knob, you will do something related to its label, and you'd think right. If you take a closer look, you'll see that there is a scale around each knob. You may guess that if you rotate the knob towards the high number, the device will do more of what the knob's label says. Again, you'd guess right. So with just some guessing, you could figure out at least the basics of a bass amplifier. Now let's take a bass. It's a whole different story. So try to approach it as someone who never played an instrument. It's pretty hard to figure out what it does. There are no labels and not even drawings that can help us understand how it works. If we look at it, we see knobs, switches, strings, but the question is still where the music actually comes from. This is a typical difference between lab equipment and musical instruments. Equipment often has clear labels because when we use it, it is very likely that we have plenty of time to figure out what we need to do, read the labels, and then operate. When we play an instrument, on the other hand, we don't have time to remember where the E-flat is or how to play a G major chord. We need to act fast and waste as little time as possible between the music that's in our head and the music that will come out of our hands. Learning a musical instrument is all about building muscle memory, and we do that only through practice. To allow such practicing, a musical instrument's user interface doesn't necessarily need to be intuitive. It needs to be reliable and consistent. We need to be sure that a given note is always on the same spot and that our gesture always corresponds to the same effect. This is a tricky question. Modular synths somehow stand in between those two categories, as we said before. Since electronic music was technically born before electronic music instruments, when the modular synthesizer finally appeared, it somehow retained some features of the lab equipment that the music was originally written for. For example, the iconic Moog Modular has a straightforward interface, with the jack sockets grouped together at the bottom of the panel and the knobs at the top with their clear scales and labels. The contemporary Buchla systems also favor the clean and labeled panels. However, for example, in the old 100 series, there was a tiny detail that made quite a difference from the East Coast approach. The target of an input wasn't described with words but with arrows. A textual element was thus replaced by a graphic one. If we take, for example, the 200 series, we can see that something else changed. The division between connectors and knobs disappeared in favor of a panel layout that put the CV input close to the knob they were referred to. A spatial element was thus used to convey a message. Such an element, combined with the color-coded array of banana socket, created an environment where also muscle memory could play a role. Having such a different spatial layout on every module allows the musician to remember where a given knob is without having to read the labels every time, thus avoiding the patch bay effect. And as a matter of fact, with modular synthesizer, patching itself became a performative act and not just an operation to be done before playing. The fact that both user interfaces still survive today means that there is no reason to prefer one over another. It's just about the musician's taste and workflow. Here at Frap Tools, we wanted our modules to have the musical instruments kinds of interface, so we went with the muscle memory approach, trying to relate all the knobs to their jack sockets. But we also pushed this concept a little bit further and we removed the labels at all. Instead, we opted for a sort of code where we assigned a function to a specific symbol and color. An arrowhead can mean either an input or an output, according to its position. If it points towards one or more jack sockets, it is an input. If it points away from one or more jack sockets, it is an output. All the modular world revolves around voltage. The most basic distinction is usually between voltage used for timing pulses like trigs or gates and voltage used for audio signals or CV. Pulses are discrete signals with two levels only, low or high. In our modules, they are associated with square shapes. The reason is that squares have only two kinds of lines, vertical and horizontal, and in the same way, a gate or trig signal has only two possible states. The other kind of CVs and also the audio signals are continuous or analog in its closest meaning. They are associated with round shapes because we can think of circles as having infinite sides in the same way that analog signals have infinite values. A subgroup of the analog audio section is the stereo audio. As you can notice in the CGM series, some modules like the group, the master or the quad stereo channel here feature stereo inputs and outputs. The left or mono input is connected to the solid colored area, while the right one is connected to the ring that surrounds it. A solid line directly relates two or more elements in the circuit, like a knob to its output or a switch to its target parameter. For example, this line here connects the fluctuating random rate to the fluctuating random voltage output. This other one here connects the pre or post fader to their respective effect sense. A dotted line stands for external CV control, and it often relates a jack socket to a manual control such as a knob or a slider. It means that the specific parameter can be voltage controlled. A dashed line relates two or more inputs and outputs. It means that they are semi-normal, or in other terms, that the signal coming from an output is internally routed to a given input. Such behavior is automatically overridden once a cable is plugged to the input socket, thus breaking the normalization. As a rule of thumb, if a module performs more than one function, the respective controls are marked with different colors. In other words, a given color defines one and only one section of the module's design. In case a module features two mirrored sections such as Sapel or Falistris generator or Brainsos oscillators or group effect sense, they are marked in yellow and green. There are many combinations of these elements. For example, an arrow within a square pointing towards the jack sockets means a trig or gate input. Suppose a dotted line connects a jack socket to a knob and a solid line connects the same knob to another jack socket. In that case, it means that the signal outputted from the second jack socket can be modified either manually via the knob or automatically via external CV patched to the first socket. It is true that with such a cryptic layout, one may have a hard time figuring out what a module does at first glance. However, with some practice and a thorough study of the manual, the muscle memory will gradually build up. Another advantage of this approach is that once we have mastered a module, the other ones will follow along more quickly, since we try to be as consistent as possible throughout all of the interfaces. As of today, in the electronic music environment, there is room for every kind of interface. On one side, for example, we have the straightforward Zweimann modules with their well-organized elements and all their labels that are just a pleasure to read. On the opposite side, we can think about the monome devices, such as the grid. This is probably the most extreme example of a cryptic but consistent design, since it removed any kind of textual or graphic label and developed a user experience based only on touch and light. If you see it for the first time, you almost can't tell if it's upside down or not, but after some practice you can build up some serious musical skill and master it just like any other instrument. Speaking of instruments, let's get back to our bass example and say that of course it is not intuitive if you don't play an instrument at all and if you see it for the first time. However, if you already play a stringed instrument such as a guitar, you'll be reasonably advanced in transposing your knowledge to the bass. And this is how we wanted to develop our interfaces. For example, once you have mastered Sapel, you should be able to figure out quite some things on your own once you see Falistri for the first time. You may be able, for example, to figure out that the green and yellow section on both modules are very likely to be identical, and you'd be right, or that the square symbol with an arrow pointing towards an input may stand for a trigger gate input on both modules, and you'd be right again, and so on. In this video we covered the foundation of our aesthetics and shared our thought about user interfaces. If you have something to add to the discussion, please let us know in the comments below. As always, if you found this video useful or if you just want to know more about our approach to modular synthesis, feel free to subscribe to our channel and stay in touch with us through our social media.